Hey everybody, it's Father Bryan here once again. Today's video is going to be quite a bit more on the spiritual side as we prepare for our second weekend in a row without public masses being offered in our parish. Some of it might be a little redundant. I've said a little bit of this before in some of the past videos here. But first I want to let you know how weird this is, not just for me, but for other priests. For those who are unaware, Catholic worship in the Catholic Church is built around the sacrament of the Eucharist, all right, receiving Holy Communion. Some other churches, if you go, it might be kind of obvious that maybe music, praise is the center of their worship, or others, it might be preaching that is the center of their worship. But for Catholics, those things have a part in every single Mass, but the high point of our Sunday gatherings is receiving Holy Communion. All right, and this is the reason that we are priests. Okay, this is the reason that we're priests. Reenacting the Last Supper, recalling the promises that Jesus made as he offered his life on the cross for us, changing bread and wine into Jesus' body and blood, and giving this to the faithful is why we dedicate our entire lives to the church. And so it's weird not to be able to do that. But as I've said, there's going to be some good that comes out of this moment in the situation that we're in, and I believe that a much healthier devotion to the Eucharist will be one of those good things. And so anyone who's paid attention to the culture within the Catholic Church over the last 50 years or so will tell you that when it comes to the Eucharist, there's a bit of a crisis of faith. Study after study shows that the majority of Catholics do not believe this doctrine. And this is reinforced, unfortunately, by their actions when they choose not to attend Mass. Well, a lot of people are going to come out of this with a deeper faith and deeper appreciation and deeper devotion to the Eucharist. Even maybe some of you watching are saying to yourselves, now that I can't attend Mass, I want to. On the other hand, this moment's also causing sort of another weird phenomenon to come to the surface. We're seeing the fruits of what, I don't really know what to call it, to be honest, maybe over-devotion to the Eucharist. Again, maybe that's not the best term. Maybe I should say that some Catholics who seemed very pious towards the Eucharist, maybe they were actually doing this with a superstitious mindset, which honestly is something that other denominations have sort of accused us of in the past. Well, maybe for some of the faithful, they're right. What I mean is that some of the most pious looking Catholics, maybe they didn't have the right mindset in their approach to the Eucharist, and we're seeing the fruit of this right now, and it's not good fruit. Some of that fruit is fear, okay? Some of it is anger towards leadership in the church who made the very difficult call to suspend Mass. People online, even people face-to-face, are saying some very awful things about church leadership in a moment where we need unity more than ever. And so my reflection today is really kind of for that second group. Those of you who might be experiencing some fear of not receiving communion, or maybe some anger towards bishops or some other leader who has suspended the Eucharist. And what I want you to know, more than anything, is that God will provide for your spiritual needs at this moment just as much, if not more, than he'll provide for your material needs. All right? Remember, God promises to work through the sacraments of the church, but he's not bound to the sacraments of the church. He can still give you what you need to live in communion with him, and there will be grace just in the desire to be at Mass and receive the Eucharist. Furthermore, there are some amazing saints who often went through long periods of time without the Eucharist. Okay, I'm going to link to an article in the description about this. I thought it was a very good article. First, of course, in the early church, again, you think of all the amazing people who were martyred, people who had deep faith and lived the teachings of Jesus very well. Well, in that church, there was no such thing as daily Mass yet. Okay, there weren't Eucharistic processions through towns. I don't even think they had church buildings to pray in the way that we do. The Blessed Sacrament was taken from their gatherings and distributed. The deacons would distribute it to the homebound and others who could not attend Mass. But God provided for their needs. Okay, receiving the Eucharist, receiving Holy Communion was not an everyday experience for them. Again, I'd need to review some history to give some details there. But the author of the article that I mentioned also mentions St. Francis of Assisi, who once spent all of Lent without attending Holy Mass once. And he didn't do that because he was blowing off the Eucharist or communion as being unimportant. He wasn't diminishing its importance. Rather, he spent that Lent in deep preparation so that the next time he received the Eucharist, it would be even more impactful. And that's what we need to do during this Lent, even though this Lent might go on a bit longer than 40 days. Okay? Let's prepare ourselves for the next time that we receive communion, because it might be the most meaningful moment of communion we ever have. The author of that article that I linked in the description also mentions St. Francis Xavier, who traveled from Western Europe all the way around the southern tip of Africa to Asia on a missionary journey. And this journey took several months. Okay, and while he was on that boat, he was not allowed to say Mass. The Pope had forbidden it, because the rocking of the boat would cause the Eucharist to spill. Okay, so the Pope said, no, you can't do it. Francis Xavier honored that. And again, he did okay. God provided for his spiritual needs outside of the sacraments, and God is going to provide for yours as well. So don't be afraid, okay? Again, in ordinary times, these are serious matters, not going to Mass, but these are not ordinary times that we find ourselves in, okay? All things work for good for those who love God. I believe that's Romans, St. Paul's letter to the Romans. I think it's chapter 8:28, somewhere around there. All things work for good for those who love God. And even this will. Here's a quote from Pope Benedict XVI. It's very long. You might need to go back, so note the time. It looks like it's about 9:20. But I'm going to read some parts of this quote. Pope Benedict says, "When Augustine felt his death approaching, he excommunicated himself and took upon himself ecclesiastical penitence. In his last days, he set himself alongside in solidarity with the public sinners who seek forgiveness and grace through the pain of not receiving communion. He wanted to meet his Lord in the humility of those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. For him, the righteous and gracious one. Against the background of his sermons and writings, which describe the mystery of the Church as a communion with the body of Christ, and as the body of Christ on the basis of the Eucharist in a really marvelous way, this gesture is quite shocking. It seems to me, Benedict XVI, more profound and fitting the more often I ponder it. Do we not take things too lightly today when we receive the most holy sacrament? Could such a spiritual fasting not sometimes be useful or even necessary to renew and establish more deeply the relation to the body of Christ? In the early church, there was a most expressive exercise of this kind, probably since the time of the apostles. Eucharistic fasting on Good Friday was a part of the church's spirituality of communion. Not receiving communion on one of the most holy days of the church's year, which was celebrated with no Mass and without any communion of the faithful, was a particularly profound way of sharing in the passion of the Lord, the sorrowing of the bride from whom the bridegroom has been taken away. I think, again, this is Pope Benedict, I think that a Eucharistic fast of this kind, if it were deliberate and experienced as deprivation, could even today be properly significant on certain occasions that would have to be carefully considered, such as days of penitence, and why not, for instance, on Good Friday once more, or also perhaps especially at great public masses, when there are so many people that a dignified distribution of the sacrament is often just not possible. He tails off there into some of these things, but the point here, of course, is that this time of abstinence from the Eucharist, which, again, is not voluntary, it's being thrust upon us, it can still have a lot of value, okay? As I said in my first video, which wasn't even on YouTube, I don't think, I think it was on Facebook, the hunger that we will experience is going to give us a greater desire for the Eucharist and a greater desire to live in communion with the Lord. And so if you want communion this time, that's good. That's good. But if you want communion, take this moment, as I've said in almost every video, to love your neighbor as the Lord would love them. Spend your Sunday calling friends and family maybe you haven't spoke to in a while. Tell them you love them. That'll bring you communion with the Lord as well. Now, I'm also going to link in the description a video on formed.org. Again, parish code FTFWEZ. It's a video called Presence. I think it's a 3-part series on the Eucharist. And maybe once again, Sunday you can watch that video. Also, we'll be attempting to live stream Mass Sunday afternoon, hopefully around 1 p.m. That's the time I'm shooting for if I can get everything set up. All right, everyone, that's the video for today. God bless you all. I love you and I miss you.